There is a particular kind of stubbornness that only the Shenandoah Valley grows, the kind that doesn't announce itself, doesn't explain itself, and doesn't apologize for itself. It grows slow, like the apple trees on the eastern slope of the Blue Ridge, and it grows deep, like the roots of men who have already survived things that should have broken them. If you've ever driven Route 7 through Clarke County, Virginia in the early spring, you know the way the light falls across the ridge just after dawn, pale and slanted and cold, the kind of light that makes every shadow longer than the thing casting it. In the spring of 1964, if you had turned off that road and followed a dirt lane up a low hill past a rusted mailbox that read Caulfield, you would have seen something that stopped most people cold. 231 apple trees. Every single one of them painted white from the ground to 4 feet high, their trunks glowing in the gray March light like something out of a dream you couldn't quite name. The orchard looked from the road like a place where someone had tried to make the trees into candles, or like someone had lost their mind quietly and thoroughly, and without anyone noticing until it was too late. The man holding the brush was 56 years old. His name was Everett Caulfield, and he was the least crazy person in Clarke County. He just happened to be the only one who knew it. If this kind of story, the quiet ones, the ones about people who knew something the world hadn't figured out yet, if that's the kind of story that keeps you company at the end of the day, then stay with us. We tell them slowly here, the way they deserve to be told. Subscribe if you haven't. We'll be here when you come back. Now, let's go back to the beginning of Everett Caulfield, not 1964. Earlier than that. There was a version of Everett that Clarke County remembered from before the war. The men who had known him in his 20s, the ones who still gathered Tuesday mornings at the Berryville Diner on Main Street, would tell you, if you asked them carefully enough, that Everett Caulfield used to laugh at his own jokes before he finished telling them, that he could talk apple varieties for an hour without losing a single person at the table, that he had a way of entering a room that made the room feel slightly larger. He came back from Korea in the spring of 1953 with both legs intact and something quieter where the laughter used to be, not broken, not ruined, just rearranged, the way furniture gets rearranged after a flood, everything still there, nothing quite where you left it. His wife Margaret understood this without being told. She was a small woman with dark eyes and the habit of watching things more carefully than most people thought necessary, and she had loved Everett Caulfield since she was 19 years old, and he had argued with her father about soil pH for 45 minutes at a church picnic and been absolutely infuriatingly right. She didn't try to pull the old Everett back out of the new one. She just moved quietly alongside him, the way a river moves alongside a changed bank, finding the new shape of things without complaint. In 1954, Everett sold a herd of beef cattle his father had spent 30 years building, and planted his first apple trees, 112 wine sap and golden delicious seedlings, in the lower 14 acres, set out in rows that he had measured with a string line and a hand level over 3 March weekends. Margaret brought him coffee at noon and sat on the tailgate of the truck and watched him work, and didn't say a word about the cattle money, which had taken considerable restraint on her part. By 1958, the trees were producing. By 1959, Margaret was gone a cancer that moved faster than anyone had prepared for, that took her from diagnosis to burial in 11 weeks, leaving Everett alone in the farmhouse on the hill with a 16-year-old son named Denton, who didn't know what to do with a father who was grieving, and had never been particularly easy to read even before he started grieving. Denton Caulfield was not a bad son. He was a son who needed things explained to him, who needed reasons and conversations and the kind of slow, patient talking that Everett had never been good at, even in his most open years, and was now almost incapable of. The boy was bright, quick with numbers, good with mechanical things, the kind of young man who could look at a broken engine and understand it intuitively in a way that impressed even the men at the Berryville Texaco. But the farm confused him. The patience it required confused him, the way his father could stand at the edge of the orchard for 20 minutes, doing nothing but looking, that especially confused him. By 1962, Denton was at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg on an engineering scholarship. He called on Sundays. The calls were short. Everett didn't blame him. He wrote this in the brown leather notebook he kept in the top drawer of the kitchen desk, a plain hardcover journal he had bought at the Woolworths in Winchester in 1960, filling it with tight, careful handwriting that grew smaller and more precise as the years went on. He had written in that notebook on a Thursday evening in October of 1962, Denton called. 13 minutes. He is becoming someone good. I am not sure he knows I can see that. On the first page of that notebook, written in red ink on the day he started, it was a single sentence: ask the right question. He had written it there because he had spent the previous winter asking the wrong ones. Why are my trees struggling? Why is my yield dropping? Why are the extension agent's suggestions not working? All reasonable questions, all pointed in the wrong direction. The right question, the one he found his way to through 3 winters of watching, and a subscription to 2 university extension journals, and a letter he had written on a cold January evening to the horticultural department at Virginia Tech. The right question was simpler and more brutal. What specifically is killing my trees? The answer had arrived in February of 1963 in a letter from a man named Dr. Ambrose Fitch, a researcher in fruit tree physiology who had received Everett's letter from a colleague who had received it from the extension office in Harrisonburg, passed along because nobody in the chain quite knew what to do with a farmer who had described his problem with that much precision and asked his question with that much clarity. Dr. Fitch's letter was 4 pages long. Everett read it twice at the kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon, then stood up, put on his coat, drove to the hardware store in Berryville, and bought every quart of white latex interior paint they had on the shelf. He ordered the rest from a supplier in Roanoke. The 38 gallons he loaded into his truck that March morning in 1964 were not an act of eccentricity. They were the final move in a 3-year investigation that had cost him at least 22 trees and a margin he still hadn't fully recovered. The problem had a name: Southwest injury, sun scald, a condition that attacked apple orchards across the mid-Atlantic in ways that most growers never correctly traced to their cause, blaming instead the winter cold or fungal pressure or soil deficiency or simple age. What actually happened was quieter and more precise than any of those explanations. In late winter and early spring, when the air was still below freezing, the afternoon sun, low and angled in the southern sky, would strike the southwest face of a tree trunk with enough concentrated energy to warm the bark several degrees above freezing. That warming reached down through the outer bark into the cambium, the thin living layer just beneath the tissue that controlled the tree's growth, and its movement between dormancy and wakefulness. It pulled the cambium partway out of its winter sleep. And then the sun dropped, and the temperature dropped with it back to 20 degrees, 15 degrees 10, and the tissue that had been tricked into waking that tissue froze. And tissue that wakes too early and then freezes does not simply go back to sleep. It dies. The death was invisible until summer, when the bark over the damaged area would split and crack and pull away from the wood beneath, and the exposed wood would darken and weep and open itself to canker and insect and fungal infection that could hollow out a tree's productive life over years or end it abruptly in one. Everett had watched 22 trees decline and die over 5 years without understanding why. He'd had 3 visits from the Clarke County extension agent, who had suggested lime sulfur spray, had recommended he check his soil drainage, had implied gently that perhaps he had planted the wrong varieties for this elevation. None of it had helped, because none of it had been right, because none of it had asked the right question. Dr. Fitch's letter asked the right question, and then it answered it. White reflects solar radiation. Dark bark absorbs it. A trunk painted white on a clear winter afternoon bounces the energy away before it can be absorbed, before it can reach the cambium, before the tissue can be fooled into waking. The tree stays cold. The tree stays dormant. The freeze that follows the sunny afternoon finds nothing vulnerable, nothing half awake, nothing to kill. Everett had read this explanation 4 times. Then he had closed the letter carefully, placed it in the back of his brown notebook, and gone to buy paint. The application was not something he approached carelessly. Through 2 follow-up letters with Dr. Fitch and 1 long telephone call to the extension office in Blacksburg, he had worked out the method with the same slow precision he brought to everything. The mixture for young trees, those under 5 years old, whose bark was still supple and needed to breathe, was 1 part white interior, latex to 1 part water. The mature trees, whose bark had thickened through years of winter, received the paint at full strength, undiluted, applied in 2 complete passes with a 4-inch bristle brush. He started in the northwest corner of the orchard on a Monday morning when the soil was still half frozen and the temperature stood at 31 degrees. He worked south through each row, finishing 1 complete row before moving to the next, so that no tree sat overnight with only a partial coat. He paid particular attention to the southwest face of each trunk, the primary exposure, but he painted all the way around because Dr. Fitch had noted in his second letter that snow cover in January could reflect enough light from the east to cause secondary scalding on the opposite face, and Everett was not a man who protected against the obvious threat while ignoring the subtle one. His hired hand, a quiet young man from Millwood named Carl, helped for the first 2 days. Then he watched. A neighbor paused at the end of the lane one afternoon. Roy Puckett, who ran the largest grain and produce operation in Clarke County, a man whose certainty about farming was exceeded only by the volume at which he expressed it. Roy sat in his truck with the window down and the engine running and looked at the white trunks for a long moment. Then he looked at Carl. He'll lose a bet. Carl kept painting. Some kind of pest treatment. I never seen a pest treatment look like that. Carl dipped his brush. Roy drove away, shaking his head. By supper time, the story was at the diner on Main Street, and by the following Thursday there was a small item in the Clarke County paper, not a proper article, just a note in the community column that read, Everett Caulfield of the Caulfield farm on Wycliffe Road, appears to have decided his apple trees needed a fresh coat of paint. No word yet on what color he plans for the barn. People cut it out, left it on the counter at the diner. It stayed there for weeks. Everett knew about it. He was not the kind of man to be unaware of what a small town was saying about him. He simply found it less interesting than the work. He kept a written log of the application, a grid of the orchard drawn in pencil in the brown notebook, each tree assigned a number, the date of first coat recorded beside it, the date of the second coat, an estimate of coverage in square inches, and any observations about the condition of the bark before painting. He was methodical in a way that other farmers found excessive, and that he found simply necessary, the way breathing was necessary, the way checking the weather before haying was necessary. It was during this survey, moving tree by tree through the lower rows on the fourth day of painting, that he found them. 7 trees, older ones planted in 1956 and 1957 in the third and fourth rows from the southern fence line. Trees he had always assumed were simply aging slower producers than the younger ones, slightly thinner canopies, the kind of modest decline you attributed to time rather than cause. He had considered that past winter whether 3 of them had run their productive course and ought to be removed. But now, painting the bark, getting close to it in a way that casual inspection never required, he could see what he had missed. Old, healed-over damage on the southwest face of each trunk, long faded scars where the bark had split and rejoined imperfectly over what must have been years of slow recovery. The trees were not aging. The trees had been scalded, probably beginning the winter of 1958 or 1959, probably every winter, since certainly before he knew what to look for, and they had been spending their energy healing themselves instead of producing fruit. He stood in front of tree number 34, a 12-year-old wine sap, his best producer in the row, the one with the heaviest limb structure and the most consistent fruit size, and ran his thumb along the southwest face where the old scar tissue had smoothed itself over. The tree was not failing. The tree had been wounded repeatedly and had survived by diverting resources from yield to repair. He stood there for a while. Then he opened his notebook and wrote T34. Old SW scarring healed but significant. Prior sun-scald estimate 4 to 6 seasons of exposure, not aging, recovering, paint twice. Paint 3 times if bark condition allows. Note if these trees come back strong this season, the method is confirmed. If they don't, something else is wrong and I need to know what. He painted tree 34 3 times. He took a photograph of it with the Kodak he kept in the truck and taped the photograph inside the front cover of the brown notebook just below the sentence written in red ink. Ask the right question. The town of Berryville, Clarke County, the people along Wycliffe Road and Route 7, and the men at the diner on Main Street gave Everett Caulfield that spring and the summer too, fully expecting the autumn to prove them right. The woman who did not laugh was Maren Hollis. She had moved into the Aldrich property the previous November, the small farm directly east of Everett's, separated from his orchard by a post and rail fence that needed work and a line of old cedar trees that provided a partial windbreak in winter. Her husband Gerald had died in September, a sudden cardiac event at 54 years old while mowing the lawn at their house in Frederick, Maryland. She had grown up in Clarke County, had wanted to come back, and had bought the Aldrich property for more than it was worth because she was not in a state of mind at that point in her life to bargain. She was 52 years old. She had been a school teacher for 23 years. She had a son named Garrett, who lived in Charlottesville and called more reliably than most sons did. She was not a farmer, had no intention of becoming one, and had planted a kitchen garden behind the house that first spring with the competent determination of a woman who understood that new things helped even when they were small. She had watched the painting from her kitchen window the first morning. She had not laughed. She had thought, that man is being very careful about something. She did not know Everett well. They had exchanged neighborly words across the fence line 3 times since November, once about the cedar tree that had dropped a large branch onto his fence after an ice storm, once about whether the road out to Route 7 flooded badly in heavy rain, and once briefly when she had brought a jar of apple butter across the fence as a gesture of introduction, and he had accepted it with quiet formality and said that it was kind of her, and she had believed him. She had formed from these 3 conversations a preliminary impression of Everett Caulfield as a man who chose his words the way a good carpenter chose his materials, not for abundance but for fitness. She found this more interesting than she expected. On the 6th day of painting, she walked down to the fence line in the late afternoon with 2 cups of coffee, her own in one hand, the extra in the other, and stood at the rail. Everett was in the 3rd row, working his way along tree 31 with a small brush, touching up a thin spot where the rough bark texture had created a shadow gap in the first coat. She held the extra cup over the top rail. He looked up. He came to the fence. He took the cup. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Does it matter what brand?" A pause. He looked at her steadily. "Interior latex, white. Any brand." She nodded as though this were a complete answer, which to her mind it was. She went back to her house. He went back to his tree. Carl, watching from 3 rows over, would later tell his wife that it was the longest conversation he had ever seen Everett Caulfield have with anyone outside of a feed store. May came. The blossoms opened in the first week, dense and white, against a sky that had finally decided to be warm, and Everett walked every row every morning with his clipboard, counting set fruit, checking the young shoots for fire blight, recording the early indicators in his notebook with the patience of a man who understood that the orchard would tell him everything he needed to know if he was willing to listen for long enough. What the orchard told him by the end of June was this: the 7 trees he had suspected of prior sun, scald damage, were growing with a vigor he hadn't seen from them in years. Tree 34 had put out the strongest new extension of any mature tree in the orchard, tight green growth pushing hard in every direction, the biological equivalent of a man finally able to take a full breath after years of laboring with reduced lung capacity. The tree was not recovering. It was reclaiming. He noted this in the log beside the number 34 without commentary. He drew a single horizontal line beneath the entry. The autumn came early and cleaned the way it sometimes does in the valley, the Blue Ridge going amber and red against a sky so sharp it looked painted on. The harvest of 1964 came in at 412 bushels across the 14 acres. His field loss rate, the percentage of fruit damaged or dropped before it could be picked, was 2.1%. The county average that year, as Everett had noted from the Extension Service data published in their fall bulletin, was closer to 6. Roy Puckett came to buy. not to ask questions, not to acknowledge anything. He came with his truck and his transaction book and his usual efficient manner, and he looked at the fruit in the sorting bins, and he said without inflection, "I'll take the full lot." The price he offered was 4 cents per bushel above what he had paid the previous year. He wrote it in his book. He shook Everett's hand. He did not mention the white trunks which glowed now in the October afternoon light with their second coat already applied for the approaching winter. That evening Everett opened his notebook to the entry for tree 34 and wrote below the horizontal line, "Yield indicator method works." Roy bought at premium. He did not ask why. He will. He closed the notebook. He set it on the kitchen table. He looked out the window at the dark shape of the orchard on the hill, the white trunks barely visible in the last of the light, and he felt something he had not felt clearly in a long time, not happiness exactly, but its functional equivalent, the specific satisfaction of having asked the right question and lived long enough to see the answer hold. The phone rang. Denton, Sunday call, slightly early. How was the harvest? Good. How good? Best since I started. A pause. Denton, 22 years old, in Blacksburg, working his way through a mechanical engineering degree with the focused intensity of a young man who needed to be excellent at something and had found his thing. The painted trees. It was not a question. Everett had mentioned the painting in a letter in March, one of the careful monthly letters he wrote in blue ballpoint at the kitchen table. Not long letters, but precise ones. Yes, another pause. Not hostile, just the particular silence of a son trying to decide whether to say the thing he was thinking or let it go. He let it go. "Good," he said. "I'm glad it worked." Everett said, "Come at Thanksgiving if you can." "I'll try." He didn't come at Thanksgiving. Everett had not expected him to. He ate alone at the kitchen table with a plate of food that Maren had left on his porch that morning in a covered dish with a note that said, "Only for the harvest. M." He ate it slowly. It was very good. He wrote in his notebook Thanksgiving. Quiet. M left food. Orchard put up well. Denton didn't come. He will eventually. The trees don't rush either. Winter settled over the valley. The white trunks stood against the brown fields and the bare hardwoods on the ridge like markers in a place only Everett knew how to read. His neighbors drove Route 7 and looked at them and thought what they had always thought, which was that Everett Caulfield had done something strange and impractical out of stubbornness or grief or some peculiarity that the war or the solitude had planted in him. They were not entirely wrong about the solitude. They were entirely wrong about the rest. Denton came in March, not Thanksgiving. He drove up the lane in a used Ford Galaxy on a Friday evening unannounced, and stood on the porch with a bag over his shoulder, looking slightly uncertain the way young men look when they have driven 4 hours on an impulse they haven't fully examined yet. Everett opened the door and stepped back to let him in, and put water on for coffee, and did not ask what had prompted the visit. They ate supper. They talked about the engineering program, about a professor Denton admired, about a bridge project he had been assigned for a semester course. Everett listened. He was good at listening in his way, better than Denton had ever given him credit for, Denton thought, though he would not have said so. After supper, Denton went to the window and looked out at the orchard in the dark. In the moonlight, the white trunks were luminous, pale lines in the March dark row after row, 4 feet up, and then the bare dark wood above. He stood there for a long moment. Then he turned from the window. "People in town think you've gone strange. he said. "Not cruel, just direct, the way young men are direct when they have been carrying a thing for months and have finally decided to say it." Carl told me what they're saying at the diner, the newspaper piece. Roy Puckett. Everett didn't answer. "I'm not saying they're right." Denton's jaw shifted. "I'm saying I don't know how to explain it. When people ask me about my father's farm, I don't know what to tell them." The kitchen was quiet. The clock on the wall ticked. "Tell them the yield numbers," Everett said. "That's not what they're asking." "I know." A pause. "It will be." Denton looked at him for a moment. He looked at the brown notebook on the kitchen table, which Everett had been writing in before supper, and had left open. He could see the tight, small handwriting, the columns of numbers, the tree-numbered grid along the margin. He didn't move toward it. He looked at it from across the room, the way you look at something you suspect might matter, without knowing yet how. He did not open it. In the morning he drove back to Blacksburg. At the end of the lane he stopped the Galaxy and looked in the rearview mirror at the orchard on the hill, the white trunks catching the early light, the whole 14 acres quiet and strange and deliberate. He sat there for a moment, then he drove. He did not know, could not have known that the next time he stood in that orchard, it would be in the coldest night Clarke County had seen in 40 years, and that he would not be alone. The winter of 1965 came in gently and left without incident, and Everett let himself believe for one season that the worst was behind him. He would not make that mistake again. But that winter, that first quiet winter, after the painted trunks had held and the harvest had come in clean, and Roy Puckett had paid his premium without a word of explanation, that winter was the kind that lulls a man. The temperature stayed moderate, the freeze-thaw cycles stayed shallow, the cambium stayed dormant, the way it was supposed to stay dormant. And when the blossoms opened in May of 1965, Everett walked his rows and felt something he was careful not to name too loudly. Confidence, maybe, or its cautious cousin. He wrote in the notebook, "Second season. All trunks painted by March 14th. No observable scald damage on any tree. 7 previously compromised trees producing at normal rate. T34 yield strong. Method holding. Do not stop watching." That last line he underlined twice. The years between 1965 and 1970 moved the way good farming years move, when nothing goes catastrophically wrong, not fast, not slow, but with the particular rhythm of seasons that reward attention without delivering drama. Everett repainted every trunk, every march. He refined his technique as the trees aged, switching several of the oldest wine saps to a slightly thicker coat after one winter when the bark on their south faces showed minor checking from temperature variance, not scald, but variance, and he noted the distinction carefully. He added 12 new trees in the fall of 1966, 4 Macintosh, 4 York Imperial, 4 Stamen extending the southern end of the orchard toward the lower fence line, planting them in the precise rows his string and level method required. He painted those young trees immediately, even before their first winter, at the diluted ratio Dr. Fitch had recommended for bark, still finding its density. Dr. Fitch himself became something of a quiet presence in Everett's life during these years, not in person, but in the correspondence that arrived in brown envelopes from Blacksburg 4 or 5 times a year. Fitch was a methodical writer, economical with enthusiasm, but generous with precision, the kind of academic who respected a farmer who kept good data because good data was rare and valuable regardless of who had collected it. He began asking Everett questions as often as he answered them, requesting specific measurements, bark temperature readings taken at the southwest face of painted versus unpainted trunks on clear January afternoons, yield comparisons broken down by tree age and variety. Everett provided all of it copied neatly into letters written at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings. He never told anyone in Clarke County about the correspondence. It wasn't secrecy. It was more that the information existed in a different register than the one his neighbors operated in, and he saw no reason to translate it into a language that would require more explanation than the results themselves eventually would. Maren had worked out that there was a researcher involved somewhere. She was not the kind of woman who missed things. She had become, across the years of fence-line coffee and occasional suppers, and the slow accumulation of small, reliable kindnesses, the closest thing Everett Caulfield had to a confidant, though neither of them would have used that word, and both of them would have been slightly embarrassed by the suggestion. What they had was more practical than that, and more durable. She brought food during the long weeks of spray season, when he had no time to cook properly. He drove her to Winchester when her car needed the transmission replaced, and never mentioned it again. She read. He farmed. On Sunday evenings, she sometimes came across the fence with whatever she'd been reading, a history, usually occasionally a natural science volume, from the county library, and they sat on the porch with the light going off the ridge, and she told him what she'd learned, and he listened the way he listened to everything completely and without interruption, asking one or two questions at the end that invariably identified the most important thing she hadn't said. She found this quality remarkable, and she found it maddening in approximately equal measure. "You knew that already," she said once after he had asked a question about the soil science chapter she'd described that led in two logical steps directly to the thing the author had spent the next 3 chapters slowly approaching. "No." "Then how did you—" "I asked the right question." She had looked at him for a moment. Then she had laughed, a real laugh, the short, involuntary kind, and he had looked slightly surprised, and then very briefly almost smiled. It was, she thought later, the most expressive she had ever seen him. The brown notebook was filling. He had started a second one by 1967, same plain hardcover from the Winchester stationery shop, same small precise handwriting, the 3-numbered grid continuing from where the first had ended. The first notebook lived in the kitchen drawer. The second one he carried with him into the orchard. She had read parts of the first one, with his permission, standing at the kitchen counter one afternoon while he finished a phone call with his Roanoke supplier, reading the entries about tree 34, about the old skull damage he'd found during painting, about the preliminary yield indicators from the first painted season. She read slowly. When he came back into the kitchen, she set it down and said, "You knew for 3 years before you found the answer." "Yes." "That's a long time to be certain you were asking the wrong question and not know what the right one was." He picked up the notebook and set it back in the drawer. "It's a longer time to keep asking the wrong one." She thought about this for several days afterward. The summer of 1970 was dry, a dry that started in June and compounded through August with the particular patience of a drought that knows it doesn't have to hurry. Everett ran his irrigation line 3 weeks longer than he had in any previous year, managing the water carefully and without waste monitoring the soil moisture in the tree wells every morning and adjusting the run times in the notebook beside the yield projections. The harvest came in at 461 bushels, lower than the 1969 high of 487, but respectable given the conditions, and the fruit quality held because the irrigation had kept the sizing consistent and the packer in Richmond, a newer arrangement, better terms than Roy Puckett had ever offered, paid for consistency above almost everything else. December of 1970 arrived warm, not pleasantly warm, dangerously warm, the kind of warm that settled over the Shenandoah Valley in the week before Christmas and refused to move, pushing temperatures into the mid-40s and holding them there, while the rest of the country moved through its ordinary winter. The grass in the lower pasture stayed green. Maren's kitchen garden, which should have been bare ground by then, showed the confused emergence of what appeared to be new growth on her garlic bed. Everett stood on the porch on the evening of December 22nd, with his coffee going cold in his hand, and looked at the orchard and felt the thing he had written down when he first noticed the warm week beginning. Not unease exactly, something more specific than that. He wrote in the notebook December 22nd, temperature 44 degrees Fahrenheit at 6 p.m. Held above 40 for 9 days consecutive. Examined Macintosh Row this morning. Bud swell visible on 3 youngest trees, not advanced but present. Cambium may be responding. If this holds another week, we will have partially broken dormancy across new plantings. Watching. Concern. Christmas Day, 47 degrees. He walked the orchard after breakfast, pressing his thumb to the southwest face of the youngest Macintosh trees, testing the bark's response. It was still firm, still dormant, but the buds were a degree further open than the morning before, the slight swelling unmistakable to eyes that had been reading these trees for 16 years. Maren came across the fence in the afternoon with food for the holiday, a covered pot of something that smelled of rosemary and onion, and found him in the 3rd row of the Macintosh block, crouched at the base of a 5-year-old tree, writing in the notebook with his coat collar turned up against a wind that didn't know whether it wanted to be warm or cold. She set the pot on the ground near the lane and walked into the orchard. She did not ask what he was doing. She read what he wrote, standing beside him as he wrote it, and she understood enough from the Sunday evenings, from the chapters she described about cambium tissue and dormancy cycles, from years of listening to a man who chose every word for its accuracy, to understand that what she was reading was not a routine entry. "How bad?" she said. He stood up. He looked at the tree, then at the ridge line, then at the sky. The Blue Ridge was clear and hard-edged in the late afternoon light, which meant the temperature would drop tonight, which meant the next day would be clear, which meant more solar warming on the southwest faces, which meant the cambium would wake a little further, which meant depends on what comes after, he said. What came after arrived on the 9th of January, 1971. The National Weather Service would later call it one of the most severe cold events in modern Virginia records. An Arctic front moving south from Canada with a speed and vertical drop that forecasters had not modeled accurately in an era when forecasting still had meaningful limits. The temperature in Berryville fell from 41 degrees at noon on January 9th to minus 19 degrees by 2 in the morning on January 10th, 14 hours, 60 degrees of drop. It stayed below zero for 9 days. Everett's thermometer on the north face of the barn read -22 on the morning of January 11th. He stood on the porch in the dark before dawn, his breath making solid shapes in the air, and looked at the orchard. The white trunks were barely visible. The cold was the kind that hurts before you've been in it 30 seconds, the kind that makes your eyes water immediately and your hands go to pain within a minute. He went in. He put on everything he owned that was warm. He went back out. He moved through the orchard, row by row in the pre-dawn dark, pressing his gloved hand to the bark of each tree. At the southwest face, the primary exposure, the most vulnerable quadrant, and then the northwest, and then the east, feeling for the hollow, give that meant the tissue beneath had died. Living bark under pressure feels solid, slightly resistant, the way muscle feels under your thumb. Dead bark over dead cambium feels different, lighter, a fraction less dense, an absence that you learn to recognize only after you have felt it enough times to know what presence feels like. The paint was doing what paint could do. It was reflecting the solar radiation during the clear, cold days that followed the front's arrival. But the paint had never been asked to do what it was being asked to do now, which was protect tissue that had already partially broken dormancy during those warm December weeks, tissue that was no longer fully asleep, tissue that had already been biochemically primed to move toward spring, tissue that was now exposed to -22 degrees of ambient cold that came not from above, not from the angle of the winter sun, but from all directions simultaneously. This was a different enemy. He had been protecting against a specific weapon. He had not fully considered that there were others. He found it on tree 34 on the morning of January 14th. He had been checking the winesap row last each morning, some reluctance to go to the tree. He knew best first, as if delaying the check might change the finding. On the 14th, in the -15-degree air of 7:30 in the morning, he pressed his thumb to the southwest face of the old winesap, 4 years older now than when he'd photographed it for his notebook cover, the tree that had confirmed the method, the tree he had painted 3 times in that first season and every year since. The bark gave, not completely, not the catastrophic separation of severe scald damage. A section 6 inches long and perhaps 2 inches wide, centered at 18 inches above the soil line where the bark had gone soft, in the way that dead bark goes soft, the hollow give he had felt on dying trees for 5 winters now and had learned to dread. He stood with his gloved hand flat against that section for a long time. The cold worked through his coat. The sky above the ridge was a clear and merciless blue. Somewhere on the Hollis property beyond the cedar line, a crow called once and went quiet. He opened the notebook. His handwriting was cramped by the cold, the letters smaller and less even than usual. He wrote T34, Estview Phase Breach, 18 inches above soil, bark soft estimated 2 to 3 square inches of cambium loss. Source event, December warmth broke partial dormancy. Arctic event, January 9th to 10th found tissue vulnerable, paint insufficient against ambient freeze following dormancy break, paint correct for radiation, insufficient for this. Different threat, different tool needed, must think. He closed the notebook. He stood in the -15-degree air and thought. He had a method that worked against one mechanism of injury. He had just discovered that the mechanism he had solved was not the only one. He had built half a solution and called it complete because for 6 growing seasons, the half he had built had been the half being tested. The other half had been waiting. Everett drove to Roanoke the following Monday. He came back with 12 bales of burlap agricultural wrap, 4 rolls of foam insulating tape, and a case of tree wound sealant in a dark paste that smelled of linseed oil. The total cost counted out at the farm supply counter was $163, more than twice his annual paint expenditure deployed in a single emergency response in a year when the drought had already pressed his margin. He paid it without hesitation. Carl had left the previous autumn for a factory job in Martinsburg that paid steadier money, and Everett hadn't replaced him. He began wrapping the lower 3 feet of every tree the day he returned from Roanoke, working alone from first light to dark, in temperatures that held between 8 and 14 degrees for the entire 2-week period. The foam tape went on first, a single layer directly against the bark as a buffer against moisture trapping, then 2 full layers of burlap over it, secured at top and bottom with lengths of baling twine tied in the specific knot his father had taught him for securing hay bales in wind, a knot that did not loosen under stress. His hands went white with cold every afternoon and came back to pain slowly every evening at the kitchen table wrapped around a coffee cup while he updated the log. On the 3rd day, he heard a vehicle on the lane. He didn't look up immediately. He was on his knees at the base of a York Imperial in the south block, working the burlap around a root flare that complicated the wrapping, and the angle required his full attention. When he looked up, Denton was standing 15 feet away. 27 years old, his engineer's coat, his mother's dark eyes. He was holding a roll of burlap under one arm, which meant he had gone to the barn first and found the supplies, which meant he had been here at least 10 minutes before making himself known, which meant he had stood somewhere and watched for a while before deciding. Everett said nothing. Denton said nothing. Denton crouched at the base of the next tree in the row and began unrolling the burlap. His technique was wrong. He wrapped too loosely at first, leaving gaps that would allow cold air infiltration. Everett watched for a moment. He did not comment. He moved to the far side of the same tree and, working from his side, demonstrated the tension required, firm overlapping each layer, covering the bottom edge of the one above it. Denton adjusted. He was, as he had always been, quick to understand a mechanical process correctly once he had seen it done right. They worked through the morning without speaking. At noon, Everett went to the house and came back with 2 thermoses and 2 sandwiches, and handed one set to Denton without comment. They ate standing near the lane, looking at the rows they had wrapped, the brown burlap, a strange contrast to the white-painted upper trunks above the wrap line. "Maren called me," Denton said. Everett drank his coffee. "She said you'd been out in -15 for 4 days, and you looked like you were planning to keep going, until you fell down or finished, and she wasn't sure which would happen first." Everett considered this. "She's not wrong." "About which part?" "Either." Denton looked at the remaining unwrapped rows. He did some calculation Everett could see him doing. "How many left?" 112. Denton screwed the cap back on his thermos. He picked up the burlap. "Show me the knot again." They worked for 3 days. Denton slept in his old room, which Everett had kept cleared without ever consciously deciding to keep it cleared, and ate whatever was in the house, which was more than usual, because Maren had quietly left 3 covered dishes on the porch on the first day and 2 more on the second day, and Everett had not mentioned this to Denton, but Denton had noticed the dishes and had not mentioned it either. On the last evening after the final row was wrapped, and they had carried the empty burlap bales back to the barn, they stood in the lane in the dark with the cold pressing down on everything. The orchard looked different now. The white trunks disappeared at 3 feet, and the brown burlap continued above the snow line, the whole effect strange and deliberate, and in the dark somehow right. "The paint," Denton said. His breath made shapes in the air. "It stops the sun from warming the bark." "Yes." "And the wrap stops the cold from what?" "Penetrating. Slows it, gives the bark a buffer on the ambient. They do different jobs." Denton was quiet for a moment. "So you needed both all along. You just didn't know the second one was necessary until now." "Yes." Another silence, the kind that fathers and sons sometimes find their way into when there are more true things to say than either of them has learned how to say. "You would have figured it out anyway," Denton said. "Eventually, even without this winter." "Maybe. But this winter made it faster." Everett looked at the orchard. "Losing a tree is expensive. Finding out why is cheap." Denton stayed one more morning, ate breakfast, drove back to Richmond before noon. At the end of the lane, Everett noticed from the porch. He stopped the car and sat for a moment before turning onto the road. He wrote in the notebook that evening, wrap complete. 247 trees, D helped 3 days. He wrapped correctly better than Carl on his best day. He did not say why he came, he does not need to. T34, status unknown until spring, waiting. Below that, in red ink, the first red ink entry. In the second notebook he wrote, paint for radiation, wrap for ambient. Both, always both. One was never enough. The spring came late and cold, the way spring sometimes comes after a brutal winter, as if the season itself is still recovering. The blossoms on the Macintosh block opened a full 10 days behind schedule. Everett walked the rows every morning with his clipboard and his notebook, and his careful eyes counting the bud break, noting the first leaf emergence, watching for the signs that told him what the winter had taken. Most of the orchard came through. 14 trees showed moderate skull damage above the burlap wrap line, the section of trunk between the top of the wrap and the first scaffold branch, which he had not covered because the wrap height he'd used had been calibrated for the primary exposure zone, not for a winter this severe. He documented every one of them, measured the affected bark area, noted the variety and age and position in the orchard and the orientation of damage. He adjusted his wrap height plan for the following winter by 14 inches upward across all mature trees. He ordered additional burlap in April. Tree 34 leafed out in the second week of May. The emergence was thin, a scattering of leaves along the lower branches, sparse and pale, the kind of growth that indicated a tree spending most of its energy on internal damage repair rather than outward extension. No blossoms. By June, it was clear that 34 would set no fruit this season. By July, the bark above the old scald point was splitting in long, slow vertical seams, the wood beneath going dark. Everett went to the tree on an August morning with the chainsaw. He stood in front of it for a moment. 16 years of records in his notebook. the photograph still taped inside the front cover of the first one, the tree that had confirmed the method, that had given him the evidence to continue when the town was still leaving the newspaper clipping on the diner counter. He set the saw and made the first cut. It took 12 minutes to bring the tree down, and another 40 to clear the wood and grind the stump to below grade so the row could be replanted in the fall. He worked methodically without ceremony. When it was done, he stood with sawdust on his coat and looked at the absence where the tree had been. He opened the notebook. He wrote T34, removed August 14th, 1971, lost to dormancy break plus ambient event December 1970, January 1971, paint insufficient alone, wrap insufficient at prior height. Both methods now updated. T34 gave the orchard 6 seasons of confirmation and 1 season of failure that made the method complete. This is not a loss. This is the cost of the second lesson. He closed the notebook. He was putting the chainsaw in the barn when Denton called. Sunday. How's the orchard? Good. Lost 34. A pause. Denton knew the tree. He had wrapped it. He had seen the photograph. I'm sorry. Don't be. It taught me what I was missing. Dad. Denton said it the way he had started saying it in the last few years, not father, the formal distance of their early years, and not the careful neutral silence of the decade after Korea. Just Dad. Simple and direct, the way things become when enough time has passed to make room for them. Were you out there alone when you cut it? Yes. I would have come. I know. You could have called. I know. Silence. Then will you call next time there's something like that? Everett considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was considerable. I'll try. It was from Everett Caulfield, the closest thing to a promise. The autumn of 1971 came in with a clear, sharp beauty, the kind of October that the Shenandoah Valley produced occasionally as if to compensate for its difficult winters. Everett harvested 441 bushels, lower than his best seasons, the effects of winter damage still pulling at the yield of 14 compromised trees, but with a field loss rate of 1.7%. The Richmond packer renewed the premium contract without discussion. Roy Puckett bought the second-grade fruit for his roadside operation and paid a cent above market and said nothing about it. Maren came to help with the sorting on the third day of harvest, arriving at the barn in her work coat with no announcement and picking up the sorting template as if she had always been part of this and intended to continue being part of it. She worked quickly and accurately, her schoolteacher's hands moving through the fruit with the same deliberate attention she brought to everything, and she talked while she worked, not about anything important, just the ongoing narrative of the days, the kind of talk that makes a silence easier to enter when the talk stops. They worked through the afternoon. When the last bin was sorted and stacked, she sat on an overturned bushel basket and looked at the brown notebook on the sorting table where Everett had been recording his counts. "Can I ask you something?" He was washing his hands at the barn sink. "Yes. Have you ever thought about writing this up, what you've learned? The method, all of it?" He dried his hands. "Dr. Fitch has asked. And I said he could use whatever he needed from the notebooks." She looked at the notebook on the table, at the shelves above it where he had lined up both completed volumes and the current one, all 3 spines facing out. 7 years of records, Two complete methods discovered one crisis at a time. Other people are losing trees, she said. Other orchards, people who don't know what you know. He picked up the notebook. He looked at it for a moment. They'll find out, he said, if they ask the right question. And if they don't, he put the notebook back on the shelf. He looked out the barn door at the orchard in the late afternoon light, the white trunks catching the last of the October sun, the rows straight, and the trees heavy with the second harvest of the cleaned-up season. He didn't answer. But she saw his jaw shift slightly, the way it did when he was not dismissing something, but filing it, putting it somewhere he would return to. She had learned to read that particular silence over 7 years of fence-line coffee and covered dishes and cold winter mornings. She picked up her coat. "I'll leave you to close up." She walked out of the barn and across the lane and through the gap in the fence. She did not look back because she knew he would be standing in the barn door watching her go, and she also knew that he did not yet know whether what was forming between them was something he had a right to want. She was patient with this. She had been a teacher for 23 years, and she understood that the right answer sometimes needs to be given the time to feel like the right answer. Outside, across the cedar line, the orchard settled into the last of the October light. The white trunks stood. The harvest was in. The notebooks were on the shelf. And somewhere in a county extension office in Blacksburg, a letter from Dr. Ambrose Fitch was making its way into an envelope addressed to Everett Caulfield, Wycliffe Road, Clarke County, Virginia, containing a question that would change the next 3 years of everything Everett thought he had already decided. The letter from Dr. Fitch arrived on a Thursday in late November 1971. Everett read it at the kitchen table with his second cup of coffee, the morning light coming low and gray through the east window, the orchard visible beyond it, as a pattern of dark lines and white trunks against the frost-pale grass. He read it once, straight through, then he set it down and looked out the window for a long time. Then he read it again. Fitch was writing a bulletin. Not a journal article, not an academic paper intended for researchers who would read it in university libraries, a practical extension bulletin, the kind distributed directly to commercial growers through the Virginia and West Virginia cooperative extension networks, the kind that landed on kitchen tables and workbenches, the kind that got read. He had been gathering case studies for 2 years. He had 3 documented orchards whose outcomes demonstrated the efficacy of physical intervention methods for sun-scald prevention. He wanted Everett's operation as the 4th, not anonymized, named. He understood, Fitch wrote, that Everett might prefer otherwise. He was not asking for anything Everett was not willing to give, but the bulletin would carry more weight, reach more growers, change more practices, save more trees if the case studies were specific and verifiable. A named farm in a named county with documented yields across a documented period of years was evidence. An unnamed case study was a story. Fitch had added in his careful academic handwriting a single line at the bottom of the 3rd page below his signature. "You have been asking the right questions for 9 years. Other people are asking the wrong ones. That seems like a thing worth correcting if you're willing." Everett set the letter on top of the brown notebook. He left them both on the table and went out to walk the orchard. It was the kind of thing he did when he needed to think, not to look at anything in particular, not to check on anything that required checking, just to walk the rows and let the physical reality of the trees work on whatever problem he was carrying. The orchard had always been better at this than any conversation. It had a way of reducing things to their actual scale. He walked for 40 minutes. The frost crunched under his boots, the burlap wraps on the lower trunks freshly applied for this winter at the new higher height, 14 inches above where he had wrapped last year, were still pale and clean, not yet weathered to the gray that would come by February. Above them the painted trunks glowed white in the thin November light. The sky over the Blue Ridge was the particular deep blue of late autumn, the kind that comes only when the air has lost all its moisture. He came back inside. He sat at the table. He opened the brown notebook to a blank page and wrote in regular black ink, "Fitch wants to name the farm," in the bulletin. Advantages other growers learn the method. Trees don't die for lack of information that already exists. Disadvantages Roy Puckett will read it. He stopped writing. He almost smiled. He wrote back to Fitch that weekend. 1 page. Clear, precise, characteristic. He said yes. The bulletin was published by the Virginia Cooperative Extension in the spring of 1973. 42 pages distributed to approximately 800 registered commercial fruit growers in Virginia, West Virginia, and Maryland. It included 4 case studies of orchard operations that had implemented physical sun-scald prevention methods. Case study 3 was identified as Caulfield Orchard, Clarke County, Virginia, 14 acres, apple production, mixed varieties, method implementation beginning 1964. The data covered 9 growing seasons, yield trends, field loss rates, bark damage, documentation variety, specific results, the modification made after the winter of 1970 to 71. Fitch had written the analysis. Everett had provided every number in it copied from 9 years of notebooks with the same precision he had brought to the first entry. Roy Puckett read it in the waiting room at his dentist's office in Berryville in May of 1973. Everett was in the 3rd row of the Macintosh block when Roy's truck turned up the lane a May afternoon, warm enough for shirt sleeves, the trees full in early leaf, and the first blossoms just beginning to open on the southern-facing branches. He heard the truck, but didn't look up. He was recording blossom density counts on the row's 6 youngest trees, a task that required his eyes and both hands. Roy stood at the end of the row for a while before he said anything. Then I read the extension bulletin. Everett noted a count moved to the next tree, the one with your farm in it. I know which one. Roy was quiet for a moment. 9 years, Roy said. You've been doing this for 9 years. 10 now. And I've been... Roy stopped, started differently. I lost 7 trees last winter, North Block mature Yorks. Bark split clear up to the scaffold on 4 of them. I thought it was the freeze. It was, Everett said. The freeze found something already compromised. The sun. The sun in January, and a warm week in November that I didn't know to watch for until 1970. Roy was quiet again. A longer quiet this time, the kind that costs something in a man who doesn't spend many of them. Why didn't you tell me, he said. Any of it. From the beginning. Everett moved to the next tree in the row. He wrote down a number. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was the same seriousness he gave every question he decided was worth answering. You didn't ask, he said. The silence after this was different in quality from the silences before it. Not hostile, not even particularly uncomfortable, just the silence of a man who has received an accurate answer to a question he had thought was rhetorical, and discovered it was not. Roy pulled a small notebook from his shirt pocket, a contractor spiral, the kind with the cardboard cover, and uncapped a pen. "The paint," he said, "interior latex, white, any brand, water it down by half for first-year trees. And the wrap, agricultural burlap, foam tape underneath. Start in January before the clear cold days. Go 14 inches higher than you think you need to," Roy wrote. His handwriting was large and angular, nothing like Everett's. He wrote for 30 seconds, capped the pen, put the notebook back. He looked at the orchard, the rows stretching south, the white trunks above the pale burlap, the blossoms just beginning in the upper canopy. He looked at it for a moment with a quality of attention he had not brought to it 10 years ago when he had rolled his window down on Route 7 and asked Carl if old Caulfield had lost a bet. "Thank you," Roy said. He walked back to his truck. He drove down the lane and turned onto the road and was gone. Everett stood in the row. The blossoms above him moved in the slight warm wind off the ridge. Somewhere in the south block, a bee found something and kept finding it, the sound dropping in and out as the wind shifted. He wrote in the notebook Roy came, asked about the method, answered his questions. He wrote it down. He said thank you and left. He will do it right or he won't, but he has what he needs. It was a 10-year conversation. It took 12 minutes. The harvest of 1974 was the one that completed the proof. 587 bushels across 14 acres, field loss rate of 1.2%, the lowest he had recorded, lower than anything the Extension Service data suggested was typical for operations of this size and age. The Richmond Packer called in October to say they were moving Everett to a new contract tier premium, plus reserved for suppliers whose fruit quality and consistency met a standard that only 4 operations in Virginia currently reached. The price per bushel went up by 31 cents. Everett recorded this in the notebook without exclamation and without false modesty. He recorded it the way he recorded everything accurately, with the date and the relevant numbers and a brief note on conditions. Denton came for the harvest. He had come every October for 3 years now, driving from Richmond on a Friday evening and staying through the following Wednesday, working the picking crew during the day and eating at the kitchen table in the evenings, and gradually, incrementally across those visits, finding a way to be in his father's house that fit both of them. He had married Cora in 1973, a quiet wedding in Richmond that Everett had attended in his good coat, sitting in the second row and watching his son look at his new wife with the specific expression of a man who has found something he hadn't known he was capable of wanting. Everett had shaken Denton's hand at the reception and said simply, "She's good." Denton had understood that this was high praise. On the third day of the 1974 harvest, Everett was at the top of a picking ladder in the winesap row when he heard Denton's voice in the row behind him. He couldn't see them through the canopy, but he could hear Denton talking in the easy, detailed way he talked when he knew his subject, the way he had always been when he understood a mechanical system well enough to teach it. The southwest face gets the most exposure because the afternoon sun in January is still low on the horizon, so it hits almost sideways. The paint bounces the energy back before it can reach the cambium. That's the living layer just under the bark. If the cambium warms up and then freezes, Cora's voice asking something Everett couldn't quite catch through the leaves. Right, exactly. So the wrap handles the other scenario when you get a warm spell in December and the cambium partially breaks dormancy, and then a hard freeze comes. The paint won't help you then because the problem isn't the sun, it's the ambient temperature. You need the insulation buffer. They do different jobs. Dad figured that out the hard way in 1970. Everett held his position on the ladder. He was aware of a fullness in his chest that he recognized as an emotion he did not have a word for precisely. It was not quite pride, because pride implied ownership of the outcome, and the outcome belonged to the trees and to the years and to the questions asked correctly. It was something quieter and more durable than pride. The specific feeling of hearing the right thing said by the right person at the right time without any orchestration. He had told Denton the method piece by piece across 5 years of Sunday calls and October harvests and 3 cold days of wrapping trees in January. He had not told it as a lesson. He had told it as a conversation between 2 people who were both trying to understand the same orchard. Denton had learned it anyway, had held it, was now giving it away in a wine sap row in October to his wife like something that belonged to him because it did. Everett picked 2 more apples. He placed them carefully in the canvas bag. He did not trust his voice immediately, so he waited until he did, and then he descended the ladder and moved to the next tree. He did not tell Denton he had heard. Some things are given more completely in silence. He wrote in the notebook that evening de-explained the method to Cora in the row. Completely correct, both parts. He understands it. Margaret would have smiled. I almost did. He stopped writing. He looked at that last sentence for a moment, then he wrote below it, I did. In November of 1983, his knees made the decision for him. The right one had been deteriorating for 3 years, a grinding that started on the picking ladders and spread to the morning walk to the barn and finally to the stairs in his own house. The left one had compensated until it couldn't. The doctor in Winchester said what doctors say when the body has simply worn through the work it was built for, that rest was necessary, that surgery was possible, but the recovery at 69 was not trivial, that there were decisions to be made about what kind of life came next. Everett sold the orchard in November, not quickly, not reluctantly. Carefully. The buyers had found him. Garrett Hollis was 31 years old, Maren's son, the one who had grown up in Charlottesville and come back to the valley 2 years ago with his wife Diane and a clarity about what he wanted from his life that his mother attributed to good genes and his father's memory. He had read the Virginia Tech Extension Bulletin at the county library. He had driven to Clarke County specifically to find the farm it described. He had knocked on Maren's door first, not knowing it was her property, next door, not knowing any of the geography, and she had stood in her doorway and looked at him and said, with an expression he would later describe to Diane as the strangest combination of surprise and inevitability he had ever seen on a human face, "You'll want to talk to my neighbor." Everett walked the orchard with Garrett and Diane for 2 days, every row, every tree. He explained the painting schedule, the wrap schedule, the dormancy monitoring. He now did every December daily bark checks on the youngest trees when temperatures stayed above 40 for more than 5 consecutive days. He explained the variety-specific differences he had observed over 20 years. He explained what the Richmond packer looked for and how to maintain the relationship. On the second evening, he went to the kitchen and came back with a wooden box sealed with a length of baling twine. He set it on the table in front of them, 7 notebooks, the plain hardcovers, the spines worn soft, the pages thick with 20 years of tight, careful handwriting. The photograph of tree 34 was still inside the cover of the first one. "These go with the farm," he said. Diane reached for the box. She stopped. "May I?" "Yes." She opened the first notebook. She read the first page for a moment. She looked up. "Ask the right question," she said. "The first page of the first notebook." Everett said, "Read that when you're not sure what to do next. Usually helps." Garrett picked up the box carefully, both hands, the way you carry something that belongs to more than one person. He looked at Everett for a moment with the direct, clear-eyed look of a young man who does not yet know whether the thing he is feeling is gratitude or something larger than gratitude, and does not have the language yet to distinguish them. "We'll take care of it," he said. Everett nodded. He believed him. Murren drove him home from the closing. They sat in the parking lot of the title company in Berryville for a moment before she started the car. The November afternoon was going gray and cold, the light already pulling back toward the ridge. "How do you feel?" she asked. He thought about it. He did not give quick answers to real questions. "Like I asked the right question," he said, and stayed long enough to see the answer hold. She started the car. She took the long way home down Route 7 past the orchard. They could see it from the road, the white trunks in the November afternoon light, the rows straight, and the trees bare now, but carrying in their structure the evidence of 20 years of correct attention, the broad scaffold branches of the old wine saps, the tighter canopy of the newer Mackintosh block, the south end where the Yorks had come in full production in the last 5 years. The burlap wraps were already on. Garrett had put them up the week before closing at the right height, the way Everett had shown him. The orchard looked exactly the same as it had looked from this road in 1964, when the white trunks had made people slow their cars and wonder whether the man holding the brush had finally gone strange. It looked the same. It meant something different now. Everett Caulfield died in January of 1989 in the farmhouse on Wycliffe Road, in the room where he had slept for 40 years. He was 81 years old. The cause was cardiac sudden, which was the way he would have chosen if he'd been given the option, though he would not have said so, because he did not talk about preferences that couldn't be acted on. Murren was with him when it happened. She had been there most evenings for the past 6 years, a fact that the county had noted without much comment, and that both of them had treated with the comfortable lack of ceremony that suited them both. She held his hand. She did not say anything, because he was not the kind of man who needed words at the end of things, and because she could not find any that were adequate, and because some silences are not empty. Denton came the next morning. He walked the orchard before he went into the house. He walked every row in the January cold, his coat collar turned up, his breath making shapes in the air, his hands in his pockets. He walked slowly. He stopped at the place in the third row where tree 34 had stood, where a stamen planted in 1972 now grew with the broad, confident structure of a tree in its best years. He stood there for a while. Then he went inside. The obituary in the Clarke County paper was 4 paragraphs. It mentioned the orchard in the second paragraph. He was known locally for his apple growing, to which he brought considerable patience and care. It listed his survivors, one son, one daughter-in-law, two grandchildren, and Maren Hollis described as a close companion of many years. Maren kept the brown notebooks. Denton had offered to take them, but she said that they should stay in Clarke County near the orchard where they belonged. She kept them on the shelf in her kitchen, the spines facing out, the same way he had kept them in his barn. On the winter morning of his burial, after the small service, and after Denton and Cora and the grandchildren had driven back to Richmond, she put on her coat and walked across the frozen grass to the gap in the fence and into the orchard. The January afternoon was cold and clear. The Blue Ridge to the west had gone a deep cold blue in the low sun, the kind of blue that looks painted on, but isn't. The light came in at a low angle off the ridge, the same light that came in on every clear winter afternoon, the same light that had been warming southwest bark faces in apple orchards across the mid-Atlantic, for as long as apple trees had grown in this valley, doing what light does, finding what was unprotected. The white trunks stopped it. Row after row after row, the paint reflected the afternoon sun back into the January air, the trunks glowing in a way that was both strange and completely right, the way things look when they have been made to do exactly what they are made to do. Above the burlap line, the bark was bright white. Below it, the brown wrap held its quiet insulation. Two methods, two different threats, both necessary, neither sufficient alone. She stood in the third row with her hands in her pockets, and the cold working through her coat, and the dry grass smell of a valley winter around her, and the particular silence of an orchard in January, which is a silence that has the quality of waiting in it, not the waiting of emptiness, but the waiting of things that are preparing to become something. She had brought the first notebook. She opened it to the first page. The red ink had faded slightly over 29 years, but it was still clear, still precise, still the handwriting of a man who chose everything carefully and used red only when he meant the sentence to outlast the conversation. Ask the right question. She stood with it for a moment. The light moved slightly as the sun dropped another degree toward the ridge. The shadow of the cedar windbreak on the east edge of the property reached a little further across the frozen grass. A crow called once from somewhere up the slope and did not call again. She thought about all the orchards she didn't know about, all the apple trees across Virginia and West Virginia and Maryland, and further, that had gone into their winters unprotected, whose growers had watched the bark split in July and called it age, called it disease, called it the ordinary losses of farming. She thought about the bulletin. She thought about Roy Puckett driving away from his dentist's office with the extension paper in his lap. She thought about how slowly good information moves through the world and how much it costs when it doesn't move fast enough. She thought about a man who had stood exactly where she was standing in January, cold, pressing his thumb to the bark of a dying tree, and had refused to accept an insufficient explanation for what he was seeing. She closed the notebook. She held it against her chest with both hands, for a moment the way you hold something that is both an object and a record of a life, the way you hold something you intend to keep. Then she walked back through the gap in the fence, through her winter garden, and into her kitchen. She put the kettle on. She stood at the window while the water heated and looked at the orchard in the last of the January light, the white trunks bright in the fading afternoon, the rows straight, the trees carrying their quiet preparation for the spring that was still weeks away, but already certain. Garrett and Diane were painting this March. She had spoken with them last week. They had questions about the brush size on the older trees, about whether the mix ratio changed for trees over 20 years of age, and she had answered what she could from memory and told them to check Notebook 4, which would have the specific entries from 1974 when Everett had adjusted the mature tree protocol. They would paint, they would wrap, they would walk the rows in the warm December days with their hands on the bark, asking the question that made the difference between a tree that was understood and a tree that was merely endured. The kettle came to boil. She poured her cup. Outside, the white trunks held the last of the light. There is a particular kind of knowledge that doesn't announce itself, doesn't look like much from the road, and doesn't apologize for being difficult to arrive at. It looks from a distance like stubbornness, or eccentricity, or a man crouching in an orchard in January cold, pressing his thumb to the bark of his best tree, but it isn't any of those things. It is what happens when someone decides that the comfortable wrong question is not enough, that losing the tree and calling it weather, calling it age, calling it the ordinary cost of things, that this is not an answer, that somewhere underneath the obvious explanation is the right one, and that finding it is worth 3 winters of reading and 1 careful letter to a stranger at a university who might know what no one else had thought to ask. Everett Caulfield's orchard is still there. The trunks are still painted white every March. The notebooks are still on a shelf in a kitchen on Wycliffe Road in Clarke County, Virginia, the spines facing out, the red ink on the first page of the first one still legible to anyone who opens it. What's the question you've been asking wrong, and what would change if you found the right one? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. We'll be here next time with another one.